I say it because hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency. Because hope should shove you out the door. Because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures, and the grinding down of the poor and marginal. And I've called my talk Fighting for Hope, because it seems to me that if we're going to have the courage to look the crisis in the face and genuinely connect with it on an emotional basis, without flinching, then we're going to need an awful lot of hope as our ally. But there's another reason for calling my talk Fighting for Hope, because it's also the title of a book written exactly 30 years ago that has had a huge impact on me. The book was written by Petra Kelly, and it's my way of paying tribute to her. And it saddens me that I imagine that many of you here tonight will have never heard of Petra Kelly, but she was one of the founders of the German Green Party and someone who has been an enormous inspiration to me. Her life, until she was killed just over 20 years ago at the age of 45, was an extraordinary one. For me, she embodied feminism, peace, activism, dedication, inspiration. An amazing politician. She was elected to the German parliament in 1983, and she entered it wearing her jeans and carrying armfuls of bright yellow sunflowers. And she was a great advocate of feeling one's politics, not just in the sense of the feminist recognition that the personal is political, but in the sense that she understood that what we do to the planet, we do to ourselves and we do to each other. She was a feminist, and she was the first person who really taught me about the links between militarism and environmentalism and patriarchy. She talked of the Green Party as the anti-party party. In other words, a party that doesn't seek to model itself on traditional political parties, but instead embraces grassroots democracy and non-violent direct action. And she wrote this: "The term anti-party party has been frequently misunderstood. To me, the term denotes a party capable of choosing between morality and power, that uses creative civil disobedience to combat every form of repression, that combines audacious imagination with efficient working methods, and that recognizes the link between world peace and peace within every individual." So that was my starting point for tonight, rereading Petra Kelly, reflecting on the climate challenge, and recognizing, in the words of Wang Yangming, a Neo-Confucian philosopher of the 15th century, that to know and not to act is not to know. And so it is with climate change. Some of you may have seen the film that was released a few years ago called The Age of Stupid, and it's based on the premise that following some kind of climate catastrophe set in around 2050, there's one sole survivor played by Pete Postlethwaite. And in the film, he looks back at reels of events, news events and weather events from today, from the past few years. He looks at the typhoons in the Philippines or the heat waves in Australia or the freezing temperatures in the US. And he's surrounded by all this old, genuine newsreel. And he says, in words that still make the hairs go up on the back of my neck when I say it, "Why is it, knowing what we knew then, we didn't act when we still had time?" And that, to me, really genuinely is the overwhelming question of our time. It quite literally haunts me. It keeps me awake at night. That question of why is it that we appear to be content to go down in history as the species that spent all its time monitoring its own extinction, rather than taking active steps to try to avoid it? And there are lots of answers to that question. The power and vested interests of the fossil fuel companies, who are increasingly not simply lobbying government, but being given senior roles within it. Or the fact that while the rhetoric of the greenest government ever might be wearing a bit thin, for some people it's still a convenient conceit in which to believe. Or the fact that people are just too busy trying to get by, trying to cope with the latest obscenity from a government that is intent on making the poorest and most vulnerable pay the highest price for an economic crisis that was not of their making, trying to keep a roof over their head while housing benefit is cut, trying to live a dignified life while disability payments are being slashed? Or is it that we're being bombarded by over 3,000 advertisements every single day, one in every 15 seconds of our waking lives, all of them persuading us, or seeking to, that the answer to our problems is to go out and do some more consuming? In the words of Professor Tim Jackson, to spend money we don't have on things that we don't need, to make impressions that don't last on people we don't care about. So lack of progress on tackling climate change is caused by this mixture of vested interests, of political paralysis and civic ambiguity. All that is doubtless true. But I'm going to suggest that another crucial part of the reason why we haven't properly addressed climate change to date is that we don't dare feel what climate change is really about. Academically, theoretically, we know about the dangers of exceeding 2 degrees warming, but we rarely make the time and have the courage to emotionally connect with that reality. And perhaps one of the reasons we don't is we fear the darkness that might engulf us if we do. So how do we cope with the feeling that humanity might just not wake up in time, that climate change might become irreversible, that societies, even in the developed world, might no longer have the ability to cope or respond? I remember how, when I first heard last year that there'd been a record loss of summer sea ice and that greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere were at their highest point for possibly 800,000 years, it felt like someone had just literally kicked me in the stomach. I felt literally winded, short of breath, and very tearful. The author, Zadie Smith, wrote about this earlier this month in the New York Review of Books, and I wanted to quote quite a lengthy passage from what she wrote because I think it's both beautiful and true. And this is what she said. There is the scientific and ideological language for what is happening to the weather, but there are hardly any intimate words. Is that surprising? People in mourning tend to use euphemism, likewise the guilty and ashamed. The most melancholy of all the euphemisms, the new normal. It's the new normal, I think, as the beloved pear tree, half drowned, loses its grip on the earth and falls over. The train line to Cornwall washes away. The new normal. We can't even say the word abnormal to each other out loud. It reminds us of what came before. Better to forget what was once normal, the way season followed season with a temperate charm only the poets appreciated. This will no doubt look very peculiar to my 7-year-old granddaughter. I don't expect she'll forgive me, but it might be useful for her to get a glimpse into the mindset, if only for the purposes of comprehension. What shall I tell her? Her teachers will already have explained that what was happening to the weather in 2014 was an inconvenient truth, financially and politically, but that's perfectly obvious even now. A global movement of the people might have forced it onto the political agenda no matter what the cost. What she will want to know is why this movement took so long to materialize. So I might say to her, the thing you have to appreciate is that we'd just been through a century of relativism and deconstruction, in which we were informed that most of our fondest held principles were either uncertain or simple wishful thinking. And in many areas of our lives, we'd already been asked to accept that nothing is essential and everything changes. And this had taken the fight out of us somewhat. And then it's also important to remember that the necessary conditions of our lives, those things that seem to us unavoidably to be the case, are not only debated by physicists and philosophers, but exist irrationally in the minds of the rest of us. Beneath contempt intellectually, perhaps, but we still experience them as permanent facts. The climate was one of those facts. We didn't think it could change. That is, we knew we could do a great deal of damage to this planet, but even the most hubristic amongst us had not imagined we would ever be able to fundamentally change its rhythms and character. Just as a child who had screamed all day at her father still doesn't expect to see him lie down on the kitchen floor and weep. Now, do you think that will get me off the hook with my slightly tiresome and judgmental future granddaughter? I worry. Oh, what have we done? It's a biblical question, and we do not seem able to pull ourselves out of its familiar, essentially religious cycle of shame, denial, and self-flagellation. That is why, I shall tell my granddaughter, the apocalyptic scenarios didn't help. The terrible truth is we had a profound historical attraction to apocalypse. In the end, the only thing that could create the necessary traction in our minds was the intimate loss of the things we loved. Like when the seasons changed in our beloved little island, or the day I went into an Italian garden in early July with its owner, a woman in her 80s, and upon seeing the scorched yellow earth and the withered roses, and hearing what only the old people will confess, in all my years I've never seen anything like it, I found my mind finally beginning to turn from the elegiac, what have we done, to the practical, what can we do? But if facing the true horror of what we're doing to our climate is a prerequisite to generating the political will to act, to move, in Zadie Smith's terms, from the elegiac to the practical, then how do we equip ourselves to face it? And I would submit that we can't do that without hope. But when I say hope, I'm aware that that little four-letter word doesn't feel very strong. It feels very soft and fragile. And I want to make it clear I'm not thinking of the kind of hope in Emily Dickinson's famous poem of the same name when she writes, "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm." Because, you know, my own fear about Emily Dickinson's idea of hope is that the storm will indeed prove too sore for its survival. The world often seems divided between false hope and gratuitous despair. Despair demands less of us, it's more predictable, and in a sad way, it's safer. Authentic hope requires clarity, seeing the troubles in the world, and imagination, seeing what might lie beyond those situations that are perhaps not inevitable and immutable. And when it comes to authentic hope, when it comes to clarity and imagination, there is no better advocate than the author and activist Rebecca Solnit. And I want to share one of my favorite passages about what she says about hope. To hope is to gamble. It's to bet on the future, on your desires, on the possibility that an open heart and uncertainty is better than gloom and safety. To hope is dangerous, and yet it's the opposite of fear. For to live is to risk. I say all this because hope is not like a lottery ticket that you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. I say it because hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency. Because hope should shove you out the door. Because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures, and the grinding down of the poor and marginal. Hope just means another world might be possible, not promised, not guaranteed. Hope calls for action. Action is impossible without hope. To hope is to give yourself to the future, and that commitment to the future makes the present inhabitable. Anything could happen, and whether we act or not has everything to do with it. So that, I think, is the kind of hope that we need, not Emily Dickinson's bird, but Rebecca Solnit's axe. As she says, again, action is impossible without hope, and anything could happen, and whether we act or not has everything to do with it. So armed with hope, perhaps we can move through what Zadie Smith calls the elegiac, what have we done, to the practical, what can we do? And so I wanted to end by setting out 3 reasons to be hopeful. And the first one, in a sense, is actually the success of the green vision, the green economy, albeit in spite of government action, not as a result of it. The economic reality, for example, speaks for itself. Last year, the green economy in the UK was worth over £120 billion, representing over 9% of the overall economy. More significantly, the low-carbon goods and services sector employed nearly 1 million people last year. That's significantly more than the auto industry and the telecommunications sector put together. Indeed, the green economy is hugely more labour-intensive than the fossil fuel economy that it replaces. And that means that at a time of austerity, investment in the green economy isn't a costly distraction away from tackling our economic difficulties. It's rather our route out of those difficulties, providing the jobs that will then ensure people can pay the taxes that go into the treasury and put the country back on its feet again. And so when George Osborne says, as he did at a recent Conservative Party conference, that we won't save the planet by putting Britain out of business, I think we can legitimately ask what planet he's on, because the one that the rest of us is on is one where we recognise that environmental protection and genuine prosperity go hand in hand. And the second reason to be hopeful, I think, is that the changes that we need to make in order to live more sustainably are positive changes in their own right, even if we didn't face a climate crisis. And one of my favourite cartoons is of a professor in a lecture theatre standing in front of a whiteboard, like the blackboard we have behind us. And on that whiteboard, he's written up all of the advantages of creating a zero-carbon economy. And so on that whiteboard, he's got more affordable public transport, properly insulated homes, people not dying from fuel poverty, more time out of the office, kids playing in the streets again, local food, allotments, and so on. And someone in the audience has got their hand up and their speech bubble says, "But what if climate change is a hoax and we create a better world for no reason?" I think we're on track to create a better world. And my final reason for hope is actually you. All of you whose idea of a good night out in Brighton on a Thursday night is to come and listen to someone talking about the climate crisis. All of you who recognise that we are actually the people that we're waiting for, and who are already doing whatever you can to bring your lives a bit closer to sustainability. People who recognise that increased environmental efficiency is important, but it's not enough. Yes, technology is part of the answer, and certainly it has to be appropriate technology. As H.G. Wells said, whenever I see an adult on a bicycle, I no longer despair for the future of the human race. But as well as that technological change, we also need transformational behaviour change. The transition town movement, the enthusiasm for allotments, the appetite for local food, the community-owned energy co-ops like the Brighton Energy Co-op, all of those things, I think, are around the behaviour change that we need to see and are beginning to see. And finally, that reason for hope is about every one of you who reinforce in your own lives the wonderful words of Robert F. Kennedy, who famously said, "Each time someone stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, she sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centres of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance." So in conclusion, the fight for hope could scarcely be more urgent and the stakes could hardly be higher. And so let me end with the words of Petra Kelly again. We, the generation that faces the next century, must know if we don't do the impossible, we shall be faced with the unthinkable. Thank you. Are there any questions? Gentleman in the second row.
Yeah, but I used to be kind of very active in politics and have kind of studied sustainability at master's degree level and stuff like that. And I kind of had the problem whereby I found the more I got into the details of sustainable development, I kind of became a bit jaded because of the complexity by it. And I'm wondering how, especially with your experience as a politician, actually how you avoid that, how you keep the broad view.
Well, I mean, I think it is a combination, isn't it, of keeping the broad view, but also certainly when it comes to policy development and so forth, you need to know what those incremental steps are and you need to get those policies right. But, I mean, it comes back to what I've said tonight, in a sense. It is about centering yourself in the here and now and in the overwhelming reality of what we have to try to achieve. And so I think that you're right. Sometimes, you know, one can get so distracted in some sense between some of the arguments between the finer points of different kinds of boilers or whatever the point might be. And to me, I guess what pulls me back is really that sense of urgency that, you know, we need to be taking a step in the right direction and we can argue about whether or not it's a little bit that way or a little bit that way. As long as it's forward, then that's what we have to be doing. And I think, you know, that sense that literally the next 8 or 10 years could be critical in terms of whether or not we do act fast enough to get off that collision course. That is what keeps me awake at night. And so I think that yes, we just need to be incredibly disciplined, I suppose, and just remember the direction that we're going in and find inspiration in the arts and find inspiration in literature and other places, because it feels to me that we've allowed climate change to become a very technical issue. And I think that for as long as it remains a technical issue, then we won't engage people fast enough and in a committed enough way to really act. And I think it can also nourish ourselves to find that reflected in literature and in the arts too.
No, I found it's been really helpful tonight as well, because I've kind of been quite bogged down, and actually I've kind of got my head out the sand again now, so that's why I'm here. So thank you.
Well, that's good. That's very good. I'll quit while I'm ahead, I think.
It's not a question, but it's just a thank you, because the next gallery that I'm going to be opening is based around bicycles.
Oh, wow.
And so actually it's given me a view as to how to create something which is more environmentally friendly. Will you come and speak at the next gallery? This exact talk.
I will, and I will know it better next time too. Yes, I can do it with my bloody notes. I'd be very honoured to. Thank you.
Which countries do you think are giving us the greatest hope, and we should be looking to get the following?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, the normal answer to that question, if you like, is, people always talk about the Nordic countries and how they tend to be far ahead of us. And being a politician, I'd point out that they've got proportional representation and they've got Green Party politicians in their parliaments and governments. And I'm sure all of that is true. And Germany, of course, when it comes to renewable energy, is far ahead of us and most other countries. But actually, I'm going to answer the question in a slightly counterintuitive way, because I'm going to say China, which is actually an odd thing to say, because everybody uses China as the excuse for us not acting. Whenever we try and have debates with the government about being more ambitious, then they'll come up with the fact that, 3 new power stations are being built every week in China, or whatever the latest thing is. But actually, what's happening in China right now, I think, is incredibly exciting, that they are creating more energy now from renewables than from fossil fuels, and they're making that shift, and they're recognizing, not necessarily for climate change reasons, but because their cities now are so full of smog and people can't breathe, and there's such a kind of fight back now from ordinary people about the kind of industrialization that they've created in that country. I think that to have China as an ally, which is, we've still got a way to go, but if they're moving in that direction, I think to be able to take away that as an excuse that's been used for so long, that there's no point in us doing things because the big countries aren't. If we can demonstrate that some of them are beginning to do that, I think that's really exciting. We haven't discussed how we end this, do I? Does someone ring a bell? That's what should happen.
Is that it? Okay. Well, I'd quite like to ask, what's the opposite of that? Where would you go, like as a family, to act very locally? Where's the checklist? Because you are inundated, one is inundated with information. To make a sustainable household, where do you look?
Do you mean
where's a good place to look to find a concise way of, because you go, oh, you're recycling, and you think, is that a good thing? You think in Brighton it is. You use less water. What is the, how do you filter information and find a thing that a household can do to be green, to be sustainable, to maximise it? If it's not what China are doing, how do you do it domestically? And how do you teach that to your family?
I mean, I think some of the best examples have actually been through things like the transition town movement, and I wasn't in Brighton at the time when the transition towns here didn't go so well, and I don't know all the history behind that, but the reason that I cite that, and I guess there are all kinds of different ways of doing it, but it is about doing it as a group. So I think if you go right down to the household level, it can be pretty tough, because you feel that you're on your own, and if there are challenges that you have, then you don't feel it's being shared, and maybe you don't feel it's being fun either. And I'm a great believer in a bit of green hedonism. I think if we're not having fun, then we're certainly not going to achieve what we need to do. So I guess I would say that there are moves. I mean, for example, up in Hanover, there's the Hanover Action for Sustainable Living, HASL, and that's a group of people that come together quite regularly at the community centre, and they'll have inspiring films, but they'll also have advice on how to do allotments, or they'll in a particular street, then they'll try and see how much energy they can save in that particular street, and so it's a collective effort. So I guess in a sense, I don't think we should be too hung up about what are the most important steps we can take. In a sense, just take the ones that are easiest to you to begin with, but then get together with others in the same community, and then
with other people, rather than thinking, I've saved this bottle, or oh no, I've got a bottle in my hand, I shouldn't have. Yes, sorry, it is recycled, it's tap water.
It's about communities of people working together.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.